I'm going to start off, but I'm going to introduce everyone first. So we are all from Bureau Veritas Building Control, and there's 5 of us here tonight, but one person's hiding in the audience. So there's quite a few people who can answer questions. So tonight, Mats and Fabrizio are going to talk about structural submissions for Gateway 2 and 3 to the Building Safety Regulator. And I'll explain why we feel we're in a position to talk about this shortly. So I'm Ruth. I've done lots of design work, and I've worked in building control for about 5 or 6 years. And at Bureau Veritas Building Control, we have a framework with the Building Safety Regulator. Mats is here. He's got a strong design background and worked with quite a few of you guys at Mason, Navarro, Pledge, and then Fabrizio is here too. And he's also got lots of design experience, having been a director of AKT too. So this is our setup at Bureau Veritas Building Control. You don't have to memorise this. This won't have any impact on your Gateway 2 or 3 submissions. But we have a number of roles within Bureau Veritas Building Control. So we do our own building control. So not every building that goes up in the UK is a higher risk building. There's plenty of buildings that aren't higher risk buildings, and plenty of large buildings that aren't higher risk buildings. And Bureau Veritas tends to do the bigger end of buildings and act as building control. So with the exception of the structural engineering team, all our colleagues are registered building inspectors within, and then we have admin support as well. Then we also do some advice to people on how you might get through a Gateway 2 submission with the Building Safety Regulator. That advice can be ignored. That advice might be insufficient, because what we can't control is who checks a Gateway 2 scheme. And then the elements in green are our roles with the Building Safety Regulator. So we check Gateway 2 applications. We're now going into Gateway 3 as well, because some of our projects are starting on site. So some projects do get given a yes by the regulator. And we also check safety case reports for occupied HRBs. And I think in September, Fabrizio is going to be doing a talk on safety cases for existing high risk buildings. And of course, the IStructE is producing some guidance that should be coming out on August the 10th on how you might contribute towards a safety case report. So that's who we are, and we're happy to answer lots of questions. And I'm now going to sit down and hand over to Mats.
Thank you very much for that, Ruth. Sorry if my voice is it's cracking up a bit today, but I'll try and get through this in a timely manner. So just quickly, just to run through the agenda for this evening. The idea is that I'll start off talking a little bit about the background for all this and what we're doing at the moment, the statutory framework. We'll then take a look at an introduction, very quick introduction to the Gateway process before moving on to some of the submission requirements for Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 applications, and some of our and the IStructE's general recommendations for a successful application, before taking a look at some of the common pitfalls that we're seeing and reasons for rejections, before I'll hand over to Fabrizio to go through some good practice tips that we've developed over the past 6 months. And then lastly, we'll open the floor to a Q&A session, and we know from experience doing these presentations before, there's probably going to be quite a few questions at the end of it, so we just kindly ask that you take a mental note of anything that might pop up during the presentation. Firstly, statutory framework, which in this case mainly the Building Safety Act that came out relatively recently, and some of the secondary legislation associated with it. So at this stage, I assume that most of you are aware of the Building Safety Act being here, and that is a law that was designed to improve building safety, particularly in high-rise and higher risk buildings, following the Grenfell Tower fire on the 14th of June 2017. With the intention of introducing a stricter regulation for design, construction, and management to ensure clear accountability for building owners, developers, and duty holders. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Act, but I would like to highlight a few things just to be aware of. And the first one is that the building safety regulator has effectively taken over the building control function for high-risk buildings, and also, taken over building control body for high-risk buildings, and also taken over the building control function, meaning that all building inspectors now have to be registered with the BSR as well to be allowed to carry out any building control activities. To be able to determine whether the regime applies to your building, you'll need to understand if your building is classed as a high-risk building first. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this definition as well. The Act defines a high-risk building as a building that's at least 18 metres in height or 7 stories, and contains at least 2 residential units, a care home, or a hospital. It's important to be aware of the fact that the regulations do not apply to care homes and hospital in occupation, effectively meaning that they will be subject to Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 applications, but will not be asked to have to go through apply for a building safety assessment certificate. For a building to be a high-risk building, as mentioned, it needs to meet the height criteria and the story threshold. It doesn't have to meet both, but it might. And when counting stories, you should measure from the ground level adjacent to the building, as you can see on the left-hand side there. It's important to note when you're counting stories, if the ceiling level of the story that you're counting is below external ground level, then it would have to be included in the story count, but if it sits above, it can be excluded. When you're measuring the height of the building, it would be regardless of the depth below ground. It would just be from the external ground level, as you can see on the right-hand side there. Secondary legislation, which we're referring to here is the Statutory Instrument 2023-909, which sets out the building control approval process, as we know as Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, for all HRBs, and details the requirements for both new builds and existing buildings as well. So, like I said, this is mainly the statutory instrument that we're referring to when we're talking about the requirements for structural submissions for Gateway 2 and Gateway 3. It's important to be aware that the legislation, it distinguishes between new builds and existing HRBs, and in summary what the legislation SI 2023-909 states is that before any work to an HRB can begin, or a particular stage of a HRB work commences, the applicant or the client in relation to that work must meet a set of requirements. So submit an application for building control approval. They need to be granted the approval for the work and fulfill all requirements in accordance with the approval, and also notify the regulator of the day the work is to start. For work to existing HRBs or building work where the works would create an HRB, a similar process applies, but the type of work is split into 3 different types, as you can see here. So we've got Category A works, which a full building control approval would be required. So this is mainly the majority of projects involving structural alterations. You've got Category B works, which would require a reduced emission, which is effectively any works that don't fall into the Category A class of works. And then there's a range of out-of-scope works, which generally refers to emergency repairs, exempt works, and scheme work, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there. Now we'll take just a quick look at the gateway processes before moving on to submission requirements and recommendations. So under the secondary legislation, SI 23-909, it sets out the specific gateway processes, or what we also call stop-go decision points, for new HRBs and existing HRBs. And as you can see here, 3 stages have been established. So you've got Gateway 1, which is effectively a planning stage. This is not necessarily as relevant to structural designers, as it mostly refers to fire safety needs relevant to land planning use. So you're not really going to be involved too much with that. The ones that are sort of more relevant to US structural designers would be Gateway 2, which is referring to effectively the last stage before building work commences. And for most HRBs, it would be the stage at which all the prescribed information in the building control application will need to be approved before building work commences. And then you also got Gateway 3, which is referring to the point at which all building work will have to be evidenced to demonstrate that it has complied throughout the construction phase with all the functional requirements of the regulations. As mentioned, Gateway 2 and 3 are stop and go points, and you won't be allowed to progress to the next stage until the previous stage has been passed. And at the bottom here, you can see how the different gateways sort of fit in with the rebus stage of work plan. So you see Gateway 2 effectively acting as a stop-go point between rebus stages 4 and 5, and Gateway 3 effectively acting as a stop-and-go point between rebus stages 5 and 6. Just want to briefly touch on transitional arrangements. There might be some of you that might be or have been involved with this, which is effectively a set of arrangements that we use to determine which higher-risk building work would continue under the old rules. So this was back in 23/24, and which building work had to be carried out to the new rules. And for these transitional arrangements to be valid, there was a set of requirements that had to be met. So initial notices or full plans had to be deposited before October 23. Works had to be sufficiently progressed by April 24, 6 months after the introduction of the new rules. And the approved inspector had to become registered building control approver before 6th of April 24. And the reason I just want to touch on this is that the requirements for a transitional application are slightly different to a normal application, in the sense that normally you have works that have progressed significantly on site, which needs to be taken into account when we as reviewers look at those applications, and you won't just be starting off with a clean slate in terms of your review. So what we recommend, because the requirements do differ between projects, to just keep an open dialogue with the BSR, just to be clear about what the specific requirements for your project is. Also want to mention changes to Gateway 2 applications. We're sort of moving into a phase now where some projects have received Gateway 2 approval and are starting on site. So this is definitely becoming more and more relevant. And what I just want to stress is that it's important to note that any changes you make to any drawings after receiving Gateway 2 approval, or what we would refer to as agreed documents, are all the documents that you provide with your Gateway 2 application. Any changes, they are considered a change, and it needs to be recorded, it needs to be logged. And throughout the build, you obviously need to make sure that you complied with all these agreed documents. But should there be a need to make any changes, it's also what we refer to as a control change. You must, as I said, make sure that you manage and assess each change in accordance with your change control plan, and record the change in your change control log, which can be requested by the BSR at any point during the construction phase of the build. Following the change control assessment that you've done, you need to determine whether there is a requirement to notify the BSR. If there's a simple revision change in a drawing, no significant structural changes, it might not even classify as a notifiable change or a major change. But should it be classed as a major change or a notifiable change, you obviously need to go through the whole process. In terms of definitions, major changes would be a change to the structural design or load path, and also any changes to external wall systems are classified as major changes. As an example of a major change, any introduction of beam splice connections, I think Ruth, you've had an experience with that, would be classed as a major change. So just be a bit careful with that. It's just something to be aware of. For notifiable changes, which are normally classed as minor or smaller changes, you do need to notify the BSR, and then they will determine whether they want any more information from you or not, depending on the extent of the change. And examples of this would be changing the number of dimensions in walls, and any changes to internal wall systems, or restraint fixing, support systems, etc. Okay, so I'll move on to submission requirements and general recommendations. So for structural submissions, this would generally refer to Part A of the regulations, but the statutory instrument 2023-909, it does also set out requirements for additional prescribed documents to be provided with the application, which might also require input from you as structural engineers. The legislation, it specifies specific information that needs to be provided with the application and approved by the BSR prior to occupation of the building, and also the processes for staged and phased submissions, and control of construction activities, and how changes are to be managed following gateway to submission. The first item on the list that you can see here is what we tend to refer to as plans, which is effectively anything that is submitted to demonstrate compliance with the functional requirements of the regulations. So this would be your structural drawings, calculations, and also specifications as well. Generally relating to Part A, but sometimes you might get involved with Part B, C, and K as well, depending on the project. And in addition to this plan submission, which is effectively what you would already be quite familiar with in terms of pre-Building Safety Act as well, there's also a requirement for these additional prescribed documents, examples being competence declaration, construction control plan, as I mentioned previously, change control plan, mandatory occurrence reporting plan, building regs compliance statement, etc. Just to note, the requirements for Cat B works are slightly different. The expectation is generally that you, as a structural engineer, will submit your calculations, your drawings. There's not a specific requirement for any of these other documents, but once you submit your application, the BSR reserves the right to ask for any additional documentations that they might see fit. Any of the items that are highlighted in bold there are generally the ones where we expect some input from the structural engineer, so it's just worth noting those down. So I'll go into a bit more detail about those points here, so the ones that we've highlighted in terms of what we would expect to see, more as sort of a general approach, and then at a later stage Fabrizio is going to go into a bit more detail in terms of good practice. So in essence, what the regulations are seeking to do is effectively avoiding piecemeal submissions and approval of building regs packages that might previously have been the way that we do it, but effectively generating a golden thread, ensuring that these submissions are comprehensive, well structured, and documented. Sufficient detail is required to ensure that the whole stage of the works complies with the regulations. And it's important to note that we want to see product-specific information. And that also means sufficiently developed subcontractor designs and detailing requirements. And as previously mentioned as well, plan submission will generally include calculations, structural drawings, should be submitted along with special details. As I mentioned, subcontractor detailing requirements for reinforced concrete, that would generally be RC design intent drawings. We're not expecting to see full RC drawings or bar bending schedules at Gateway 2. That will come later at Gateway 3. For steelwork, we're looking at, again, design intent drawings, connection forces, and typical and special detail checks. For bit steel, we'll go into more detail a bit later on that as well. And then in terms of specifications, this is a list of generally what we would expect to see depending on the project, but generally always design performance, piling, concrete or steel, depending on your building, masonry and timber, and earthworks. Quickly on competency declaration as well. It generally just should demonstrate that the duty holders meet the requirements of the Building Safety Act and the industry standard competency requirements. So it should generally include profiles for designers, checkers, directors of companies, and the company itself. There's further information on this for structural designers and checkers in the Engineering Council's Structural Discipline Annex. There's also now a joint IStructE and ICE registration process for HRBs as well, which Ruth is on the committee for. So should you have any questions about that, feel free to ask her after the presentation. Construction control plan as well, which is quite an important one, as we've been seeing over the past couple of months as well. It's not necessarily expected that the structural designer is going to be solely responsible for this, but you would be expected to provide some sort of input, especially in terms of construction quality requirements, linking back to Eurocode 1990, design supervision levels, interface management, who's responsible for what at interfaces between different materials, different designers, ordinary and independent inspections for the structure, linking back to Eurocode 0 inspection levels, safety critical element inspections, requirements for compliance evidence, and the requirement for as-built drawings required for Gateway 3 as well. And what we're looking for is specific examples of requirements for different elements as well, not just a general, we're going to provide as-built drawings. It's more for slabs, what sort of documentation are you going to be providing at Gateway 3, because it's something that we're going to be reviewing and assessing and effectively determining whether this will be sufficient to demonstrate that the building is still meeting the functional requirements at Gateway 3 stage. The building regulations compliance statement as well. Generally, the input from the structural designer would be in the form of a structural report or a design philosophy setting out different aspects of the design. Generally, what we're looking for here, identification of elements covered in the submission, codes and references, loadings, descriptions of structure, gas and waterproofing protection measures. We're not expecting you to design it, we're expecting you to understand what the requirement is. And for waterproofing, if your concrete, say, is providing waterproofing, you obviously need to provide a design for that. Modeling and design methodology for each element, if you're using analysis software. Provisions for disproportionate collapse. How are you planning to meet the requirements of A3 of the regulations? Also, general description of lateral stability, material properties used in your analysis models, fire protection measures and performance, and any impacts on third-party assets as well. I just want to mention as well that this is most of the time one of the first things that we look at as reviewers, and a lot of people use it sort of like an index to find all the information that they're looking for. So it's quite important that the input from you guys is good and makes it easy for us to find what we're looking for. And again, Fabrizio will talk about this a bit more later, but generally some of the questions that you should ask yourself is why, how, and where. And I'll let you explain a bit later. But so there might also be a requirement for structural designers to provide some input into the fire and emergency file. Generally, what the expectation is there is to provide a description of fire protection measures, which should already have been provided in your design report, design risk assessment to demonstrate how you've dealt with different building safety risks, and also a description of the robustness strategy is good to have included in your fire and emergency file. Because of a lot of similarities with safety case reports and building assessment certificates, as Ruth mentioned, is one of the other things that we do. The fire and emergency file, there's an expectation that post Gateway 3, that information would also be used and fed into the safety case report for your specific building as well. Just quickly before I move on, I want to touch on the requirements for Gateway 3 as well. So for Gateway 3, the applicant would effectively require a completion certificate as evidence that the works have been inspected and comply with the functional requirements of the regulations, essentially confirming that the building work that's been carried out is safe. And in support of that application, there's a range of requirements again. The main one being any plans that are necessary to show that the HRB work complied with all the different applicable requirements of the regulations, which effectively corresponds to information that's provided in line with the IStructE structural plan of work stage 5. So nothing revolutionary there. This information, importantly, should already have been identified in the construction control plan, as mentioned before, and should include manufacturing and construction documentation, as-built drawings, reinforcement drawings, bar bending schedules, steelwork fabrication drawings, and site visit and inspection records to demonstrate compliance of the design works. And then, yeah, these other documents that are listed here as well. I've just added a note there about SE may be asked to take on enhanced inspection requirements. That's effectively in support of other duty holders meeting their duties, such as the PD, that you might be asked to go to site more to ensure that the building works are actually compliant with the regulations. So lastly, before I hand over to Fabrizio, I'm just going to talk quickly about some of the common pitfalls and reasons for rejections that we're seeing currently. Generally where we're seeing designers currently going wrong with their submissions. It's become quite clear that there are some trends that are developing, some slightly more concerning than others. So this here is effectively just a summary of an analysis that was done back in, I think it was March, subject to a Freedom of Information request, I believe, where you can see that the majority of rejections are currently due to Part B of the approved document. And then in second place is structure, which is still relatively high. I think it comes in at 19%. Part B 52.5%, so there's a big difference, but I think 19% is still relatively high for structure. There might be some sort of inconsistencies in terms of, at least we believe that sometimes they might reject an application under Part B, but not under Part A, despite there being issues with Part A as well. If there's a lot of issues with Part B, they might just reject it on that basis. So it could potentially be that that Part A number is slightly higher, but and if we look a bit closer on the Part A reasons for rejection. We see that structural calculations. It's quite a generic one, but it comes out 30%. Followed by external walls, wind loading, subcontractor design, pile design, site investigation, reinforcement details and structural design. And some of the common reasons you can see here. So for structural calculations, effectively insufficient calculations to demonstrate that the building has been designed sufficiently to Eurocode requirements. External walls, insufficient details or calculations for wind posts, masonry panels, masonry support, SFS. Sometimes we see brickwork support information missing from submissions. Insufficient details on movement joints and how movement is accommodated. This next one is quite a big one. Cladding loads not included in the analysis. There have been occasions where cladding loads have been forgotten about. And another big one as well is obvious lack of coordination between structural engineer loading allowances and facade design. Wind loading is quite a big one as well. Insufficient and incorrect wind load calculations. I'll go into a bit more detail about that on the next slide. And subcontractor design, some examples include not provided at all. Drawing stating that specific designs are to subcontractor design but not providing the actual design. Insufficient design information and calculations for balconies is another one, and another one that seems to be forgotten about is entrance canopies, just not being a part of the submission even though they're there. Disproportionate collapse, another relatively big one, slightly concerning considering it's quite an important one. And some of the recurring comments are relating to confusing or contradictory statements on disproportionate collapse, and also not providing calculations for vertical ties, horizontal ties, peripheral ties, or key elements, as you can see there. Pile designs not being provided, or preliminary pile capacities used in the design without a final design for the piles. Also, there's been examples of no site investigation being provided, no reinforcement detail or intent provided, and there are some examples of impractical design solutions where multi-storey buildings have had facades that have been supported at one level only, and turned out that it just didn't work that way. So these are some of the rejection wording of some of the notices. So, I mean, it ties in with the previous slide, goes into a bit more detail. So under structural calculations, we see that one project had insufficient breakdown of superimposed loads. Again, cladding loads not being shown on the loading plans is another big one as well. It might have been included in the design, but if it's not shown in the loading plan, we as reviewers or assessors, we don't actually know whether it's been included sometimes. This third one as well is one that keeps coming back, is columns, RC columns being designed as axial only members, and moments not being taken into account in the design of the columns. Wind loading, there's two that we see a lot of. One is torsional effects not being considered for single core buildings. Another one is funneling in accordance with the National Annex. Which are the ones that you see there as well. And disproportionate collapse, like I mentioned, calculations for vertical tie forces, peripheral ties, horizontal ties, key element design. So that's sort of the end of my section. So I'll hand over to Fabrizio to go into a bit more detail about some good practice tips that we've developed over the past 6 months or so.
Thank you. Hi, so I'll run through some good practice tips following the first eight months, almost 12 months of reviewing Gateway 2 projects. It's worth noting that the regime of review, which is under the Gateway 2 process is slightly different from a normal building control, and there is a kind of a more detailed review which all the submission go through. So it's important that we'll start with some easy wins. So it's important that the submission is kind of comprehensive and very consistent in all the aspects. So it's important to have a very good presentation in the way that it's packaged, and all the reports need to be clear and need to be quite well referenced. They need to tell the story of how the building has been designed in all the aspects. So all the reports should be clear in the way that they are structured, with a clear content page, index for all the elements that are presented in the design calculations, and why not have also hyperlinks which make it easy to follow the design through the different reports. Often we have reports which have hundreds, if not 1,000 pages. So it's important that they are clear, use images, diagrams, graphical outputs are kind of easy to describe all the design approaches. So avoid just submitting thousands and thousands of pages of outputs, software outputs without any description. Make sure that you have cross-references between the documents, drawings and reports, so that, again, it's easy to follow. It's important that a good submission has a very logical and easy process of how it's been put together. And then, of course, use the appropriate guidances that are available in the industry from the IStructE and other bodies such as the SCI or Syria. So make sure that you follow standard and recognized methods of design. Regarding the typologies of the documents that need to be produced, can be kind of summarized in 4 categories. So there are reports, different type of reports, calculations, design philosophy reports, structural calculations, actually, and then drawings and technical specifications. So the first document, which usually is reviewed during the Gateway 2, is the design philosophy, which is essentially explains all the design approaches. So of course the project description, all the constraints and site description, so that the reviewer can understand what are the all the boundary conditions and the site specific elements of that affect the design. And then of course the design approach for all the elements for vertical and lateral stability and any other aspects. The Gateway 2 submission is a submission for the entire building, and that's important. There are some kind of phased submissions, but focusing on the majority of the submission, which are for single buildings. They need to cover all the elements of the structure, substructure and superstructures. Sometimes we see that buildings are designed by different designers. So especially if there are kind of special materials or technologies like precast or modular structures, but the substructures are reinforced concrete, for instance, there needs to be a design philosophy which brings together and makes kind of a consistent description of the building. Next is modeling assumptions, as kind of Matt's mentioned earlier. It's important that a design philosophy describes all the different elements, how they've been modeled for the different conditions. It may be for lateral or vertical loads, or for vibration, or any other aspects. There may be different assumptions, and those have to be clarified to prevent any confusion in how the reviewer is kind of looking at the different elements of the structure. Design criteria, that's something that is quite common that we see in a lot of submissions. There needs to be all the aspects that are used to design the building needs to be sufficiently and comprehensively described, from the loads, the load combinations, all the design codes, all the guidances used, materials. Those are kind of can be referenced, in specifications or other documents. Movements and tolerances. This is sometimes submitted as a separate report or an appendix to the design philosophy. And then any other aspects such as vibration or other aspects such as disproportionate collapse, blast, or any other accidental loads. Fire and durability section, that's something that is important to highlight for the entire project, rather than kind of leaving it to the single elements of the building, so that there is a kind of a clear demonstration of the strategy that has been adopted for both fire and durability. And then third-party asset interfaces. That's something that is, although is not part of the submission, is important to demonstrate that the design is fully coordinated and sufficiently advanced, so that there are no design changes or design developments expected beyond the Gateway 2 submission. So it's important that's kind of, I will touch on third-party assets later, in terms of different requirements that are required. Then after that, the calculation report is of course one of the most the larger documents and the most important documents of the submission. It needs to be, as I said, a very clear organization of the report. Often reports they go directly into the calculations without explaining the premises and the design approaches that have been adopted for the different elements. There needs to be every element of the structure, of course, needs to be designed, or every element type. We don't necessarily need to see the design of every single element of the structure, as long as there is a very clear rationale of how elements have been designed. They can be grouped, and the most representative, the worst cases of each kind of family of elements can be kind of demonstrated that is satisfactory. And then a number of kind of critical design elements, critical elements that are that we see where kind of a lot of mistakes or missing information is found. One is transfer structures. We are actually required by the IStructE, the BSR to look more in detail at transfer structures because of the criticality of the design elements. Often not all the aspects are considered. It's important to consider all the stages of design. So for tall buildings, there may be construction stages design and kind of design checks that are required, for instance, for retaining structures at different stages during construction, which affect the permanent design. Punchy shear and strut and tie models, those partially kind of refer back to transfer structures, but they refer back to transfer structure, but is not, I don't know what's happening there. We see that sometimes engineers don't present the design of these elements in a correct way. They don't make the correct assumptions in terms of the bending moments or the perimeter, the punchy shear perimeter. and strut and tie models often they are not the theory is not applied in a correct way. So it's quite important to check all these aspects. As mentioned by Matt, another thing that where we find is walls and columns design don't always consider all the actions which are applied to these elements, and that's a bit concerning. It's something that should be looked with care. Pile out of tolerance moments. We find that often when there are single piles or two pile caps, the out of tolerance eccentricity moments are not properly resolved into the substructure. And then with regards to connections, especially steel connections, what is required at Gateway 2 is to make sure that all the connection forces are defined and all the design of the typical cases, all the typical connections are submitted together with typical details. So anything that may affect the design at a later stage needs to be defined actually at this stage, so that there is no room for changes. Another thing that looking at the calculation report is important is to keep in mind that we are looking at the compliance of the submission with building regulations. There are three main regulations in Part A, A1, A2, and A3. So the first one is loadings. So it's important to consider to describe and document all the loadings that are applied to the structures in a graphical manner with loading diagrams. Make sure that all the models have got clear definition of all the loadings, clear description of the individual loadings, for the self weight, the superimposed dead loads, all the finishes, facades are important in order to demonstrate that there has been a full coordination with the team, the design team, and the subcontractors that are inputting into the final design. Any aspects which are such as like snow or thermal loads have to be described in all the sections, and then wind loads, as previously mentioned. Often we see that not all the requirements of the Eurocode are taken into account into the analysis of the structure under wind loads. So torsional effects for buildings have to be considered, and aspects such as funneling. Then moving on to Part A2, in terms of the ground movements, the submission is to demonstrate that the absolute settlements and the differential settlements between the structural elements have been undertaken. All the design verifications for retaining wall movements, and if there are any impacts on third-party assets and how they are kind of affecting the permanent structures movements. And then lastly, but not for importance, is disproportional collapse. That's an area that is there is understandably there is a lot of focus in the review, and that often is overlooked in some or all areas. So it's important to ensure that the ties are designed to the correct standards. It's important to note that ties for concrete structures are different from ties of steel structures, for instance. So the relevant design codes and the relevant national annexes have to be followed. Key element design. Often we see that key element design checks are done, but for instance, not in a comprehensive way. So, for instance, if you have a transfer structures, the transfer slab or the transfer beam is checked, but not the supporting elements. Actually, the code is quite clear in these aspects. Vehicle impact and other accidental loads are sometimes not considered. There are different requirements for internal car park and external structures subject to a risk of vehicle impact. Those have to be followed to meet the requirements. And then for consequence class 3, of course, there is the systematic risk assessment, which actually is looking as a whole at all the potential risks of structural failure of the building, and that kind of feeds back into all the design checks that then are undertaken. So it's quite useful to see the risk assessment, often part of the design philosophy, and then kind of reference back into the calculation package. Lastly, we're doing a kind of a thorough review, but we're not doing a check review for you. We are doing a check in terms of compliance. So you need to make sure that the design is being checked. We do find submissions where structural elements are shown with warnings, or even more concerning with fail, and there is no description, no justification on the reason why. Yeah, so make sure that there is a quality control check that is done on the submission before before it is issued to the BSR. Any specialist design packages and secondary structures, differently from the old regime, let's say, old specialist design needs to be submitted as part of the Gateway 2. So any special elements such as precast concrete, PT slabs, any piles, embedded retaining walls, or in terms of the secondary structures such as stairs, facades, balustrades, handrails, balconies, and similar, the design has to be fully developed and coordinated with the primary structure to kind of construction level. So it needs to be clear that what are the loadings, the performance specifications, the product specifications, the subcontractor detail design, any drawings, layout details, and if relevant, and also in terms of inspection, we'll come to that. Is the inspection regime. We are almost at the end. I've kind of combined structural drawings and technical specifications. So in terms of the structural drawings, of course, this has to be a full set of structural drawings, which has to be like a construction issue. Kind of, it needs to be final, fully coordinated. There shouldn't be any notes or any signs that the design is not fully coordinated. Notes such as subject to confirmation of the MEP contractor. That's is something that shows that the design is not final. There shouldn't be any elements that are in abeyance as well. In terms of RC information for Gateway 2, RC intent drawings are required, but not bar bending schedules and RC detailing drawings. If it is a transitional project, then it may be more relevant to submit RC drawings, because often the submission happens at the end of or kind of partial completion of the concrete frame. And then a full set of specifications. In terms of the specifications, it is worth noting that any aspects which are to do with specialist products have to be specified and not left to later stage for definition. Any waterproofing products, for instance, which may affect the design, or any specifications for special type of elements such as decking or special type of bolts and so on. With regards to the compliance statement, I've kind of summarized in 3 steps. So the first step, when putting together a compliance statement, is a demonstration of how the submission complies with the building regulations, which in the case of the structures is mainly Part A, kind of marginally Part B, in terms of the requirement for fire protection. So it's important that you describe what you identify, what are the regulations that your submission complies with. How does it comply? There should be kind of a narrative, and then where, so a reference into the submission documentation, how you are complying to the relevant regulations. Mostly is A1, A2, and 3. So it's kind of clear. It should be pretty straightforward to achieve that. Other documents which require the input of the structure engineer are, of course, the construction control plan. So there are kind of 3 main aspects which require some attention. The first is to define the site inspection regime. So there should be a clear definition of how often and what elements are inspected. What is the frequency of inspections, if there are special elements in the building structures which require inspection. Together with the site inspection, there is also the design supervision level, which has to be defined in the specifications, or it could be also defined in the construction control plan, but it kind of is anything that is to do with the quality control of the design and the construction has to be will require for structures the input into the construction control plan. And then monitoring regimes. So as I mentioned earlier, any third-party assets, adjacent buildings will require any requirements in terms of monitoring have to be considered. I skip samples and testing. The samples and testing are often They are often described more in the technical specifications, but there should be a reference into the construction control plan in order to make sure that the construction control plan is kind of capturing as a whole all the aspects which are to do with quality control.
Yes. Okay. We have no idea how those blue lines appeared, but I think they actually really add to the presentation. Okay, so the previous slide that we slightly skipped over was basically just to say we finished. But we do suggest that, so the IStructE has been really busy recently and produced lots of guidance. And as I think Fabrizio and Matt said, the Building Safety Regulator has actually asked us to check that people are following the guidance in the IStructE Guide on Transfer Structures. So this is quite a big thing. So we would recommend anyone doing design has the IStructE Transfer Structure Guide. It's also free. It's been downloaded 5,000 times as well. So obviously people are using it. Although 4 of those downloads were me, because it's easier to just download it again than to find out where I've stuck it on SharePoint. But a key document on submissions is this IStructE publication, Structural Submissions for Higher Risk Buildings under the Building Safety Act. So again, if you're doing a submission, I would recommend that you get hold of that. I think that's one you actually do have to pay for. The first document we've got on our list is, this is written by someone who has a lot of involvement with the IC and IStructE over the years. And it's about the practical application of Eurocode 1990 with respect to design supervision levels and construction supervision levels and how that fits in with consequence classes of buildings. So again, would suggest that you have a look at that. I mean, I don't know why I'm saying all this. Basically, look at all of them is the summary. In terms of this, the competence statements, so the ICE and the IStructE launched a joint register on the 1st of May to demonstrate competence to design higher risk buildings. And there is a structural discipline annex which basically describes these competencies. It's not the easiest read. It's very in-depth. So I would recommend that if anyone wants to be on this register, and I would encourage people to apply, that they potentially speak to someone who is on the committee to get a few ideas as to what to put it together. Because if you read the UK spec, you would just think there's no way I can demonstrate competence. It's pages and pages. What we found in this committee is that the people on the committee, and this have managed to pass, and people from the external people who've applied haven't passed. Now that sounds like it's this incredibly terrible stitch up, but it's actually more that there isn't really any guidance out there. There is going to be guidance, and it's being produced at the moment. But if people want to apply earlier, it is worth talking to someone on the committee, because actually, I mean, I did my submission and it wasn't that big a piece of work. I mean, it ruined a few weekends, but it wasn't as daunting as would be implied by the Structural Discipline Annex. So I'm very happy to talk to people, and the committee are happy to talk to people who want to apply until this guidance goes out. So I think we can't have many slides left. So we've got our contact details in if anyone wants to email us, and these slides will be going out. So they're all there. Okay, so let's get on to questions.